Amara had always been strong. She had to be. As a young black woman in her mid-20s, she knew the world didn't always offer her the same opportunities or the same respect as it did others. But what the world didn't know was that Amara was different from most. She had an inner strength that no amount of discrimination or hate could diminish. She had grown up in Southside Chicago, in a community where everyone knew each other's names. Her parents, immigrants from Nigeria, had worked tirelessly to build a better life for their children, and they instilled in her a deep sense of pride and self-worth. Amara wasn't one to back down from challenges, even when the world around her tried to tell her she didn't belong. When she moved to this predominantly white apartment complex in West Chicago, she had hoped to find peace and a fresh start. The rent was affordable, and the apartment was close to the library where she worked as a junior research assistant. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she was determined to make it her home. At first, things had been quiet. The neighbors, though not particularly friendly, didn't go out of their way to be hostile. She spent her days working at the library, reading, writing, and focusing on her dream of one day becoming a historian. Amara was content, if not completely happy. But everything started to change the day she met Gary. Gary was the kind of person who wore his racism like a badge of honor. He was in his late 40s, balding, with a gruff exterior and a sneer that never seemed to leave his face. He lived in the apartment directly across from Amara's, and from the moment they first locked eyes in the hallway, he made it clear that he didn't think people like her belonged there. Amara had brushed it off at first, thinking he was just another bitter old man. But it wasn't long before Gary's subtle, passive-aggressive comments turned into outright verbal abuse. Whether it was a nasty remark about her hair or a comment about her kind not being welcome in the area, Gary never missed a chance to remind Amara of her place. It started small. He would make snide remarks as she passed by him in the hallway, sometimes under his breath, sometimes loud enough for her to hear. Amara had learned not to engage, knowing that arguing with people like Gary was futile. But the microaggressions continued. One day, after she had asked him to move his car, which was blocking the entrance to the garage, Gary looked her up and down and muttered, "Should have stayed in your own neighborhood." At first, she had ignored it. But after a few more incidents like this, Amara began to feel that uncomfortable knot of anger in her stomach every time she saw him. The sting of racism wasn't new, but being subjected to it every day in the place she called home began to wear her down. She had hoped that this new neighborhood, away from the tensions and struggles of the South Side, would offer some respite. But it seemed that racism was everywhere, even in places where she had hoped to find peace. The tension escalated over time until it reached a breaking point. One evening, after a long day of work at the library, Amara was walking back to her apartment when she noticed Gary standing by his door. He was talking to a friend, but as she approached, he turned his attention to her. "What's up, princess?" he called out sarcastically, his voice dripping with mockery. Amara kept her head down, keeping her pace steady, hoping he would just leave her alone. But Gary wasn't finished. "You think you own this place or something?" he sneered. "Maybe you should head back to wherever you came from." Her heart pounded. That was it. She had had enough. Without thinking, Amara spun around, her voice rising with a mixture of frustration and anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she snapped, her words sharp, full of the pent-up frustration she had been carrying for so long. "I live here, just like you. And if you have a problem with that, maybe you should leave." Gary's face twisted with rage. His friend stood there awkwardly, but Gary didn't seem to care. "You think you can talk to me like that, huh? You're nothing but a joke. You and your kind don't belong here." The words cut deeper than she expected. Amara's chest tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. But this time, she didn't walk away. She didn't let it slide. Instead, she stood there, facing him. "I belong here just as much as you do," she said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere. But you're nothing more than a bitter, small-minded man who can't see past his own hate." For a moment, Gary looked stunned. Then he sneered again, turning to walk into his apartment without another word. Amara stood there for a second, her breath coming fast, before she walked into her own apartment and slammed the door behind her. That night, as Amara sat on her couch, replaying the confrontation in her head, she realized something. She was tired of letting people like Gary win. She was tired of swallowing her anger, of letting racist comments slide, just to keep the peace. She had to stand up for herself. But what Amara didn't know was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The following day, when she was out running errands, she would cross paths with someone who was more than just a stranger, and her act of kindness would set Gary's world on a collision course with karma. The next few days passed by in a blur for Amara. Her confrontation with Gary had left her feeling empowered, but also anxious. It wasn't like her to engage in conflict, but something about his constant harassment had finally pushed her too far. She couldn't keep letting him get away with it. Still, the bitter taste of that exchange lingered, and as much as she wanted to move on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Gary's behavior didn't change. If anything, his hostility increased. Every time Amara saw him in the hallway, it was like a tense standoff. He would glare at her, muttering under his breath, and she would stare him down, refusing to show fear. The silent war between them escalated. Amara had always been someone who kept to herself, someone who believed in peaceful resistance and letting her actions speak louder than words. But the thought of having to share her home with someone like Gary felt like a suffocating weight. She hated that he was making her feel like an outsider in a place that should have been safe, a place she had worked so hard to make her own. One Saturday afternoon, Amara was at the local farmer's market, browsing through fresh produce. It had become one of her favorite places to unwind, a brief escape from the stress of her work at the library. She was enjoying the simplicity of the moment, picking out some fruit, when a voice suddenly called out behind her, "Hey, excuse me." Amara turned to see a man in his mid-30s, wearing glasses and a friendly smile. He seemed a little out of place, his shirt tucked in neatly, and his mannerisms were polite and respectful. She was taken aback for a moment before realizing he was addressing her. "Sorry to bother you, but I noticed you have great taste in produce," he said, laughing awkwardly. "Would you be willing to help me pick out some fruits? I'm not very good at it." Amara smiled. "Sure, I can help you with that." They spent a few minutes walking together, chatting casually about the best ways to prepare fruits for smoothies, and he mentioned that he had recently moved to the area and was still getting used to the neighborhood. His name was Chris, and he was kind, down to earth, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. As they walked through the market, they continued to talk about local spots, books, and life in the city. It was refreshing, so different from the tension that always seemed to follow her when Gary was around. There was something about Chris's presence that made her feel at ease. They parted ways after exchanging numbers, and for the first time in a while, Amara felt hopeful. Maybe not everyone in this neighborhood was like Gary. Maybe there were others who saw beyond skin color, who didn't carry their hate and ignorance so openly. But it wasn't long before Amara's brief moment of peace was shattered. The very next day, she was at her apartment trying to relax after a long week when there was a loud knock at the door. Amara froze. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Gary stood in the hallway, a smirk on his face as he looked her up and down. "Had to come talk to you," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I saw you chatting it up with that guy at the market yesterday. You know, I don't appreciate you spreading your influence around here." Amara stared at him, her heart pounding. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply helped someone who seemed friendly. But to Gary, anything she did that wasn't in line with his narrow view of the world was an offense. "What's your problem, Gary?" Amara asked, her voice calm but firm. "I was talking to someone new. That's all. You really need to stop policing my life." Gary's face twisted in anger. "You think you can just go around pretending you're one of them? Just because you work at the library doesn't mean you get to act like you're part of our community. You're nothing but a guest here." His voice grew louder, as if trying to provoke her. Amara took a deep breath. She couldn't let him see how deeply his words cut. She had come to realize that nothing she said would change his mind, but she wasn't going to be intimidated any longer. "You don't control me, Gary," she said, her voice steady. "And frankly, I'm tired of you treating me like I'm inferior. If you don't like it here, maybe you should leave." Gary's eyes darkened and his jaw clenched. "You really don't get it, do you? I don't know how they let you move in here, but I'm going to make sure you regret it." Amara stood still, her pulse quickening. Gary was threatening her now. His words were filled with malice, but she had learned to read people like him. He was afraid of someone who didn't look like him, someone who was challenging his view of the world. He was lashing out because he knew she was stronger than he ever could be. "I don't scare easily, Gary," Amara replied, her voice even more resolute. "You can say what you want, but I'm not going anywhere. You don't get to push me out of this place." Gary took a step forward, his expression hardening, but before he could say anything else, Amara slammed the door in his face. She leaned against the door, her breathing heavy, heart pounding. What had she just done? She had stood up for herself, but now she feared the consequences. Gary wouldn't stop. He would escalate it. The days that followed felt like an ominous calm before the storm. Amara knew that Gary would find some way to make her life harder, but she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him win. The true turning point came a week later, when Amara's life took an unexpected turn. After a busy day at work, Amara decided to go for a walk to clear her mind, hoping the fresh air would help her unwind. As she passed by the coffee shop near her apartment, she noticed Chris sitting by the window, reading a book. She smiled, her spirits lifting a little as she walked inside. "Hey, Chris," she greeted, walking over to his table. "Mind if I join you?" Chris looked up, his face lighting up. "Of course. Sit down." As Amara took a seat, Chris glanced at her and noticed the stress in her eyes. "Everything okay? You don't look like your usual self." Amara paused, hesitating for a moment. Gary's threats still echoed in her mind, but she knew she needed to talk about it. "Honestly, it's been tough," she said, her voice soft. "There's a guy in the building who's been making my life miserable. He's racist, and he's constantly making things difficult for me. I don't know what to do anymore." Chris listened carefully, his expression sympathetic. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Amara. No one should have to go through that. But you're not alone in this. I've got your back, whatever you need." Unbeknownst to Amara, Chris wasn't just any neighbor. He was more connected than he let on. He had connections in the community, and he had been quietly keeping track of Gary's behavior. Gary's actions, though hidden beneath his facade of respectability, were well known to others who had seen his racist tendencies. And now his time was coming. The tension between Amara and Gary reached a boiling point. Gary's verbal assaults, while always aggressive, had now taken on a more sinister edge. Every time Amara saw him, she could feel his hostility growing. It was as if he saw her strength and resilience as a threat to everything he believed in. He had grown bolder, showing his true colors in public spaces, making crude comments under his breath whenever she passed by. It had become unbearable. For Amara, every moment spent in the apartment complex was a reminder of Gary's hatred. Her once peaceful haven had turned into a battlefield. She could no longer pretend to ignore his presence, no longer convince herself that things would change on their own. A few days after their confrontation, Amara received a letter in her mailbox. At first, she thought it was just another bill, but when she opened it, her stomach dropped. The letter was from the apartment complex management. It stated that there had been several complaints about Amara's disruptive behavior in the building, including an altercation with another resident, Gary. The letter demanded that she attend a meeting with management to discuss the situation. The irony was not lost on her. Gary had reported her, twisting the narrative in his favor. He made it sound like she was the aggressor, the one causing problems, while he portrayed himself as the innocent victim. Amara's heart sank. She had always kept her head down, always tried to maintain peace. But now, it seemed like her act of standing up for herself was being used against her. Amara stared at the letter for a long time, her mind racing. How could she prove the truth? Gary's reputation was untarnished in the building. He was well-liked, often seen chatting with neighbors and attending events. Meanwhile, Amara had always kept to herself, avoiding attention and keeping her interactions minimal. She knew that in this moment, it was her word against his. But Amara was no stranger to injustice. She had been fighting for a seat at the table her whole life, from her childhood in Southside Chicago to now. This was just another battle, and she wasn't going to let Gary win. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Amara spent the days leading up to it preparing herself. She gathered evidence of Gary's previous behavior, text messages from neighbors who had witnessed his outbursts, pictures of verbal threats he had made, and a record of his history of complaints against her, all of which painted a clear picture of who the real aggressor was. She knew the meeting with management would be difficult, but as the date drew nearer, she found herself growing more determined. She wasn't going to back down. On the day of the meeting, Amara walked into the apartment office, a folder of evidence in her hand. Her palms were clammy, her heart pounding, but she refused to let fear take control. The receptionist led her to the manager's office, where Gary was already sitting, his arms crossed, his face set in a cold, smug expression. Amara sat across from him, keeping her composure, her eyes not wavering from his. Gary had a way of making her feel small, making her feel like she didn't belong. But today, she wouldn't let him win. The meeting began with the manager, Mr. Thomas, reading through the letter of complaint Gary had filed. "Amara, we've received complaints that you've been causing disruption in the building," Mr. Thomas said, glancing at her. Specifically, a recent incident with Mr. Gary Thomas. Amara raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Thomas, I believe the situation has been misrepresented. Gary has been making continuous racist remarks towards me, and I have attempted to ignore them for the sake of maintaining peace. However, his behavior escalated, and I was forced to respond." She slid the folder of evidence across the desk. Mr. Thomas looked at it with some surprise before flipping through the pages. Gary, his eyes narrowed, sat silently, clearly uncomfortable. Amara's voice became stronger. "Gary has a history of making inappropriate remarks towards me, and I have several witnesses who can confirm this. I didn't escalate this situation, but I will not be a victim of racism in my own home." Gary shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't speak. Mr. Thomas paused for a moment, looking at Amara with newfound seriousness. He glanced at Gary, who was now visibly tense. "I see," Mr. Thomas said after a long pause. "We take these matters seriously. We will need to review the evidence, and we will take the appropriate actions based on what's been presented." Amara left the meeting feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had spoken the truth, and now it was out of her hands. She couldn't control the outcome, but she knew she had done the right thing. The days that followed were agonizing. Every time Amara saw Gary in the hallway, there was a tense silence between them. She could feel the tension building, as if the walls around them were closing in. Gary had yet to confront her directly, but his disdain for her was palpable. It wasn't long before she started noticing small, subtle changes in the apartment complex. Neighbors who had once been friendly now seemed to avoid her, and the atmosphere felt heavier, more hostile. It was as if Gary's influence in the building had begun to spread. One evening, after returning from work, Amara found a letter taped to her door. Her heart sank as she read it. Gary had filed another complaint. This time, he accused her of harassing him, claiming that she had been threatening and verbally abusive. Amara's blood ran cold. This was his retaliation. He was trying to ruin her reputation. She wasn't sure what to do next. She was already at her breaking point, but the weight of this new accusation felt like an impossible burden. The following morning, as Amara walked to work, her thoughts were consumed with Gary's lies. But what she didn't know was that karma was already moving in the background, quietly working to expose the truth. Gary's actions had consequences, and soon he would be forced to face the consequences of his hatred. The following days were nothing short of chaotic. Amara found herself navigating an increasing number of subtle obstacles. Gary's complaint, though unfounded, was taking its toll on her mentally and emotionally. His attempts to ruin her reputation had only escalated, and she was constantly on edge, wondering what he would do next. She felt as though she was being suffocated, not just by his harassment, but by the silent judgment from the neighbors who seemed to align themselves with him. Despite the mounting pressure, Amara refused to back down. She kept her head high, knowing that the truth was on her side. Gary had gone too far this time, but little did he know his actions were beginning to catch up with him. One morning, Amara received a shocking phone call while she was getting ready for work. The caller ID displayed a name she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "Is this Amara?" The voice asked. "Yes, this is Amara," she responded, her hand gripping the phone tighter. "I'm Detective Sullivan, and I'm calling in regards to an investigation we're conducting into Gary Thomas. We've been looking into a series of suspicious activities, and we believe you might have some crucial information. Can you meet with me later today?" Amara's heart skipped a beat. Gary? Suspicious activities? She had no idea what this was about, but it felt like a turn she hadn't expected. What was happening? I don't know what this is about," she said, trying to steady her voice. "But I can meet you." "Good. I'll be at the coffee shop down the street from your apartment complex in 2 hours. Please come by. I'll explain everything then." Amara quickly hung up, her mind spinning. What could Gary possibly be involved in? She couldn't fathom what was happening, but she knew that something big was unfolding, and she was about to be caught in the middle. 2 hours later, Amara sat across from Detective Sullivan in the coffee shop, her fingers nervously tapping on the mug. Sullivan was in his mid-40s, wearing a plain shirt and slacks, his demeanor calm but serious. There was something about his eyes, though, that told Amara this wasn't just an ordinary inquiry. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice," Sullivan said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Let me get right to it. We've been investigating Gary Thomas for several weeks now. We've received numerous tips about his criminal activities, but what really tipped the scale was something his wife recently discovered." Amara sat up straighter. "Criminal activities? What exactly are you talking about?" Sullivan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Gary Thomas has been running an illegal money-lending operation for years. He's been using his position in the apartment complex and his charm to manipulate and control people. The worst part is that he's been racially profiling the tenants, singling out people of color and making them pay higher rates and fees. He's threatened many tenants, including you, to keep quiet about it. We've also linked him to a string of fraud charges." Amara's stomach dropped. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Gary, the man who had harassed her for months, was involved in criminal activity? It was hard to process. How could someone like him hide such a dark side behind a facade of politeness and control? Amara began, feeling the weight of the information sink in. "How does this have anything to do with me? I've barely had any interaction with him other than the harassment." Sullivan nodded. "That's just it, Amara. You've been his target, and it seems like you might be the key to his downfall. He knew you were a new tenant, and you didn't back down when he tried to bully you. Your strength made him feel threatened. We believe Gary may have targeted you to silence you. He's been watching you more closely than you realize." Amara felt a sense of disbelief. She had always known there was something wrong with Gary, but to learn that his racism went far beyond personal vendettas and into illegal activities shook her to the core. Sullivan leaned forward, his voice low. "Here's what we need from you. Gary is slippery. He's been careful not to leave a trail, but we've tracked some of his communications. If you can help us get a confession from him, it would be the final nail in his coffin. He's already under surveillance, and we're close to arresting him. We need a witness, someone who has direct knowledge of his activities." Amara sat quietly for a moment, her mind racing. She had already been through so much. The thought of confronting Gary again, of having to deal with him knowing that his dark secrets were now out in the open, was terrifying. But she also knew that this was her chance to not just fight back against his racist actions, but to take down the bully who had terrorized her for so long. "I'll do it," Amara said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll help you." Sullivan smiled, clearly relieved. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this will help. You're doing the right thing, Amara. After the meeting, Amara walked back to her apartment, her thoughts consumed by everything Sullivan had shared. Gary's world was crumbling, and she had just agreed to be part of the final blow. The fear that had taken root in her for months started to subside. She was in control now, but there was still a small, nagging feeling at the back of her mind. Was she putting herself in danger? The next few days passed in a blur. Amara spent most of her time preparing for the confrontation, gathering evidence, and working with Sullivan's team to get Gary's confession. It felt like a strange form of revenge, but more than that, it was about justice. Gary had hurt so many people, and he needed to be held accountable. Finally, the day came. Amara stood outside the complex, staring at Gary's apartment, knowing that her actions would change everything. Gary had no idea what was about to happen. She walked up to his door, knocked firmly, and waited. The next few minutes would define her fate and Gary's. Amara stood outside Gary's apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. This was the moment she had been building up to, the moment where everything she had endured would either come to a head or crash down in a way she couldn't control. She had gathered all the evidence she could. Phone records, messages, a list of Gary's numerous complaints against her and other tenants, and a detailed account of his racist and threatening behavior. She had shared it all with Detective Sullivan, and now the final piece of the puzzle was going to fall into place. Gary had no idea that his world was about to shatter. Amara knocked firmly on Gary's door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. For a long moment, there was no answer. Just as she was about to knock again, the door swung open and Gary's familiar, smug face appeared in the doorway. Well, he sneered, looking her up and down as though she were an insignificant bug he was about to squash. Didn't expect to see you again. I thought you were done bothering me. I thought maybe you'd finally learned your place. Amara held her ground, her voice steady but firm. I'm not here to argue anymore, Gary. I'm here because you've been hurting people, and it's time for you to face the consequences. Gary's expression shifted. The arrogant confidence that usually painted his face faltered for a split second. It was clear he wasn't expecting this confrontation to go in this direction. What the hell are you talking about? You need to get out of here now. Amara took a deep breath, standing tall. I'm not leaving until we have this conversation. It's time you understood that your actions have consequences. You can't keep bullying people, harassing them, making them feel less than human without paying the price. Gary's eyes narrowed as his jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a troublemaker. All you ever do is cause problems. Amara shook her head. No, Gary. I'm not the problem. You are. I'm not the one threatening people, making them pay for your illegal money-lending schemes or profiting off the pain of others. Gary took a step back, his face turning red with rage. You think you can come here and make accusations like that? You're out of your mind. Amara raised her hand, holding up the evidence she had gathered. I don't think I'm out of my mind. I have all the proof I need, Gary. We've been watching you. The police are onto you. All those complaints you filed against me, it's time for the truth to come out. Gary's eyes widened as the realization began to sink in. You're working with the police? Amara nodded. I'm not just working with the police. I'm the reason they're closing in on you. I've been tracking your every move, collecting your threats, and now you'll have to answer for what you've done. For a moment, Gary just stood there, frozen. Then, his face twisted into something darker. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life? You think you're going to destroy me? His voice rose in anger, and Amara could feel the tension crackling between them. You've already destroyed yourself, Gary, Amara replied, her voice calm but unwavering. You're not just a racist bully anymore. You're a criminal, and your time is up. Gary's eyes flickered with fear. For the first time, Amara saw something other than arrogance in his expression. He took a step back, his hand trembling as he reached for the door, but before he could close it, Amara pushed it open just a little more. You're done, Gary. The police have everything they need to take you down. Your little scam is over. Gary looked at her, his face drained of color. For a brief moment, Amara thought she saw genuine fear in his eyes. She had spent so long wondering if her confrontation with him would ever get to this point, and now that it had, it was clear he was terrified of the truth being exposed. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Amara turned, and in the hallway stood Detective Sullivan along with two other officers. Gary's expression shifted from fear to outright panic. "We're here to talk to you, Gary," Detective Sullivan said firmly, stepping forward. "We've gathered evidence of your illegal activities, including your harassment of Ms. Amara here, and we've got witnesses who are ready to testify against you." Gary tried to move toward the door, but the officers stepped in front of him. "You're not going anywhere," Sullivan said, his tone matter of fact. "You're under arrest." Amara stood frozen in the doorway as the officers handcuffed Gary, his protests falling on deaf ears. For years, Gary had terrorized her and others, and now he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. His hateful words, his racism, his manipulation, and his criminal activity had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. As the officers led Gary out of the apartment, Amara stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. It was surreal. She had finally taken control. She had stood up for herself, and it had changed the course of her life and Gary's. Detective Sullivan turned to Amara with a nod. "We couldn't have done this without you. Your testimony and your evidence were the missing pieces we needed. We're going to make sure Gary faces the full extent of the law." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it wasn't just about seeing Gary in handcuffs. It was about the power she had taken back. She had stood up to the racist bully who had terrorized her, and now the world knew the truth. Gary's reign of harassment was over. As the officers left, Amara stepped back into her apartment, her mind racing. What had just happened? The weight of everything she had been through was starting to sink in. She had faced Gary's hatred, his threats, his manipulation, and now she had exposed him for who he really was. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. She was stronger than she had ever been. Amara sat down on the couch, her hands still trembling. She couldn't help but smile. Karma had come for Gary, and it had arrived in full force. Amara knew there would still be challenges ahead, but in this moment, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. She had faced her fears, and she had won. Gary's dark secret had been exposed for the world to see, and there was no going back for him. His karma was brutal, and it was only a matter of time before he was forced to pay the price for all the lives he had tried to ruin. The days after Gary's arrest passed slowly, and the tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud seemed to dissipate, replaced by an eerie stillness. Amara couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Gary, the man who had tormented her for months, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The entire apartment complex seemed to be buzzing with whispers and rumors, but there was an underlying shift in the air. For the first time, it wasn't Gary's influence that everyone was afraid of. It was the power of truth and justice. Gary's arrest had become the talk of the building. Neighbors who had once ignored Amara or avoided her were now treating her with a newfound respect, albeit with a few awkward glances. The apartment complex had always been a microcosm of racial divides, with Gary representing the dark undercurrent of prejudice and hatred that was pervasive, if unspoken. Now, with his arrest, it felt like the balance had shifted. The power dynamics in the building had been upended, and while it was still too early to tell how everything would settle, Amara knew that things could never go back to the way they were before. Amara continued her routine, returning to work at the library, but the weight of the situation lingered. She hadn't expected the fallout to be this deep. Some neighbors approached her with apologies, others with gratitude. But there were also those who, perhaps still under Gary's influence, continued to avoid her or look at her sideways. Her courage had made waves, but it had also opened a door to a complicated reality. One afternoon, as Amara was walking back to her apartment after a long day at work, she saw Mrs. Keller, an older woman who lived 2 doors down, standing near the entrance. Mrs. Keller had always been quiet, polite but distant. She'd never engaged much with Amara, and the few times their paths crossed, it was often followed by a quick glance or a rushed hello. "Amara, dear," Mrs. Keller called out, her voice soft but firm. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, for standing up to Gary. I'm sure it wasn't easy." Amara was surprised, but she smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Keller. It wasn't easy, but someone had to do it." Mrs. Keller's expression softened. "I've been living here for over 20 years. I've seen a lot, and I've kept to myself most of the time. But when I saw how he treated you, I knew something needed to be done. Gary was always pushing people around, always acting like he owned the place. It's a shame it had to go this far for anyone to see what kind of person he really was." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sadness. "Thank you. I didn't do it for recognition. I just knew I had to do something." Mrs. Keller hesitated for a moment before adding, "You've got a strength inside you that many people here didn't realize, and maybe it's time we all start standing up for what's right, instead of looking the other way. You've given us all courage, Amara." Amara smiled at the older woman, feeling a sense of accomplishment that she hadn't anticipated. She had made a difference in more ways than she had realized. Her actions weren't just about taking down Gary. They were about waking others up, inspiring them to challenge the prejudice and fear that had held them back for so long. However, while some people began to support her, there were still lingering effects from Gary's actions. Not everyone was on her side, and some neighbors still regarded her with wariness, uncomfortable with the fact that she had exposed the truth about Gary. Some of them believed the status quo should have been maintained, and seeing a woman of color rise up against a prominent figure in the community made them feel uneasy. The real fallout came when the media caught wind of Gary's arrest. News outlets began reporting on the case, and soon, the small apartment complex was buzzing with outsiders trying to get the inside scoop. Amara was thrust into the spotlight in a way she hadn't expected. Journalists showed up at her door, hoping for an interview or comment. People started looking at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity, and some even accused her of making a spectacle of the whole situation. It was clear that the community was divided. Amara found herself facing not only Gary's lingering influence, but also the backlash from those who didn't understand why she had taken the stand she did. Some saw her as a hero, others saw her as a troublemaker. In many ways, she was fighting two battles. One against the past injustices she had endured, and one against a world that wasn't ready to accept the truth she had brought to light. One afternoon, as she was heading to the store, Amara received a call from Detective Sullivan. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made her pause. "Amara, I need to talk to you," he said. "There's something you need to know." Gary's involvement in the criminal activities went much deeper than we initially thought. "We've uncovered a web of fraud and exploitation that goes back for years. His influence extends far beyond this apartment complex." Amara's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Sullivan's tone grew more serious. "It seems that Gary's not the only one involved. We've been tracking his illegal dealings with several other residents in the complex who may have been complicit in some of his actions. We'll need your help to testify further, Amara. This goes beyond just you. We're looking at a network of people who have been enabled by his manipulation." Amara stood still, taking in what he had said. She had known Gary was dangerous, but she hadn't realized how far his web of control stretched. Now, it was clear his empire of racism, exploitation, and abuse of power wasn't just going to fall apart. It was going to take others down with him. Amara agreed to assist the investigation further, even though it meant that her role in the case was far from over. Gary's downfall had just begun, and as the police continued their work, it became evident that the consequences of his actions would be felt by many. But Amara was undeterred. She had already proven something to herself. She was no longer a victim. She had taken control of her life, her story, and now she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was fighting for justice, for change, and for a future where people like Gary would no longer be allowed to bully and manipulate others. As Amara sat down that night, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she realized that the battle was far from over. But she had already won the most important thing, her freedom. She was no longer bound by the fears that had once kept her silent. And she knew one thing for sure: karma had caught up with Gary, and the storm was only beginning to show the true consequences of his actions. Amara had never been one for the spotlight. In fact, she had always preferred to keep a low profile, blending into the background as much as possible. But as the days turned into weeks after Gary's arrest, Amara couldn't escape the attention that was now following her. The apartment complex was no longer the same. Gary's arrest had set off a ripple effect, and Amara's involvement in exposing his dark side had placed her at the center of a movement that was more significant than she had ever imagined. It started with a simple conversation in the hallway. Amara had just returned from the store when she saw Mrs. Keller again, this time with a bouquet of flowers in her hand. "Amara, dear, I've been meaning to give you this," Mrs. Keller said with a warm smile, extending the flowers toward her. "You've done something truly remarkable. I don't think any of us realized just how bad things were until you stepped up." Amara hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She had always believed that the work was the reward, not the praise. But in that moment, as she took the flowers, she realized that she was no longer an outsider. Her courage had bridged a gap that had always been there. People were seeing her differently now. As a person of strength, someone who had challenged the system and won. "Thank you, Mrs. Keller," Amara said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I never expected any of this." Over the next few days, Amara noticed more people stopping her in the hallway, offering their congratulations. Neighbors who had once avoided her now greeted her with respect, some even stopping to talk to her about what had happened with Gary. There was a sense of unity in the air that hadn't existed before. For the first time, it felt like the community was starting to open its eyes not just to the abuses of one man, but to the ways in which racism, hate, and fear had been allowed to fester unchecked. Amara's phone began to ring more frequently. It wasn't just her neighbors who were reaching out. There were reporters, activists, and even local politicians who wanted to talk to her. The local news had covered Gary's arrest extensively, and Amara's role in exposing his criminal activity was being hailed as heroic. At first, she had declined the interview requests, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of being in the public eye. But as the pressure mounted, she realized that this was bigger than just her. Her story had become a beacon for others, showing that even in the face of adversity, people could stand up, fight back, and demand the change they deserved. One afternoon, Amara agreed to meet with local journalist Erica Johnson, who had reached out to her several times for an interview. Erica was an experienced reporter with a reputation for exposing corruption in the community. Amara had initially hesitated, unsure of how much she was willing to share, but after some thought, she knew it was time. They met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from Amara's apartment, and as they sat across from each other, Amara felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. This was her chance to share her story, to let people know what she had been through, and to finally take control of the narrative. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Amara," Erica began, her tone professional but empathetic. "I've read your story, and I think it's important that people understand just how significant this moment is. Gary's arrest is just the beginning. Your actions are part of something much bigger than any of us realize." Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I didn't set out to become a symbol or a hero. I just wanted to be treated with respect. I wanted to stand up for myself and for others who have been hurt by people like Gary. I didn't expect it to turn into this." Erica nodded, her pen poised above her notepad. "But that's exactly it. Your courage is inspiring. And now, people are seeing how one person can spark a chain reaction of change. How do you feel about all of this attention?" Amara thought for a moment, glancing out the window of the cafe, her mind reflecting on the past few months. "It's overwhelming, to be honest. I'm not someone who craves attention, but I know that this is important. If my actions can help others find their voice, if they can see that they have the power to fight back, then I can't be silent anymore. The article Erica wrote was published the next week, and it quickly gained traction. Amara's story was shared on social media platforms, discussed in online forums, and even referenced in political speeches. People were inspired by her bravery, by the way she had confronted the system and taken down someone who had used power and hatred to control others. In the days that followed, Amara was approached by community leaders and local organizations that focused on racial justice and advocacy. They invited her to speak at events, to share her story with a wider audience. It wasn't just about Gary anymore. It was about the larger issue of systemic racism and how even the smallest act of resistance could lead to monumental change. One evening after work, Amara found herself standing in front of a small crowd at a local community center. She had agreed to speak at a rally for racial justice, and as she stepped up to the podium, she felt a sense of nervousness wash over her. She wasn't used to speaking in front of large crowds, but as she looked out at the faces in the room, she saw something that gave her strength. These were people who understood her struggle, people who had fought the same battles, faced the same injustices, and wanted to make the world a better place. Amara cleared her throat, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she spoke. I've spent a lot of time wondering whether or not I was doing the right thing by standing up. It's never easy to speak out, to challenge what's always been accepted. But what I've learned through all of this is that we can't stay silent. Not anymore. We have to fight for what's right, not just for ourselves, but for the people who will come after us. The crowd erupted into applause, and Amara felt the weight of her journey settle on her shoulders. She had never imagined herself as an activist, as a voice for change, but now, standing there in front of these people, she realized that she had become part of something bigger than herself. The weeks that followed were a blur of media interviews, public speaking events, and new friendships formed with people who shared her vision for a better, more just world. Amara's courage had sparked a fire, one that couldn't be extinguished. As she walked back to her apartment that evening, she passed by the parking lot where Gary's car had once been parked. The space was empty now, but she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of closure. Gary was gone, and with him, the fear and hatred that had ruled that small corner of the world. Amara had taken back her power, and in doing so, she had created a space where others could do the same. The weeks following the rally felt like a dream, surreal in the way change had arrived so swiftly. The apartment complex, once a place of tension and fear, now felt different. Amara had become a symbol of courage. Her story had spread beyond the small neighborhood, and as more people reached out to her, offering thanks and admiration, Amara couldn't help but wonder what her life would have been like if she had never stood up to Gary. Would she have spent her days walking through life feeling unseen, unheard? Would she have continued to accept the world as it was? Amara's transformation was undeniable, but it wasn't just the way the world viewed her that had changed. She had changed, too. She had grown in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her resilience had given birth to an inner strength she never knew she had. The fear and self-doubt that had once plagued her were now replaced with a quiet confidence, one that allowed her to walk through the world with her head held high. As Amara stood at her apartment window, watching the city below, she couldn't help but think about the life she had built. She had come so far from the woman who had arrived in that building, hoping for nothing more than a little peace and quiet. Now, she had become part of a larger movement, a movement that wasn't just about her personal triumph over Gary, but about creating lasting change in the community. Amara had been asked to speak at another event, this time for a citywide gathering on racial equality. The invitation came as a surprise, but it also felt like the natural progression of her journey. She had already been a voice for those who had suffered in silence, and now she was being called to lead, to be more than just a survivor, but to be a beacon of hope and action for others. The event was held at a large auditorium, and as Amara walked up to the stage, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. The room was packed, filled with people from all walks of life, activists, politicians, educators, and community leaders. They were all there to hear what she had to say. As she stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, Amara felt a rush of emotions. This was her moment. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for. The courage to speak out, the determination to make a difference, the strength to never back down. She was no longer just Amara, the woman who had been silenced by racism. She was Amara, the woman who had brought the truth to light. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. Thank you all for being here today. I'm honored to speak before you, and I'm grateful for the chance to share my story. She paused, glancing at the crowd. This journey began for me as an attempt to find peace, a place where I could live without being judged for the color of my skin. But instead, I found something I never expected, a community of people who were ready to stand up for what's right. The room was silent, listening intently. I know that my story isn't unique. There are millions of people like me who have faced the same struggles, microaggressions, racism, fear. We've all had to fight, some of us silently, some of us openly. But what I've learned through all of this is that the fight isn't over. It doesn't end when one person speaks out. It continues when others hear that voice and decide to speak themselves. The crowd was still, captivated by her words. Amara took another deep breath before continuing. Gary was only one man, and his actions were only one example of the hate that exists in our world. But I want to say something important. We have the power to change that. It's not easy. It won't happen overnight. But every time we choose to speak the truth, to stand up for what's right, we create ripples of change that cannot be ignored. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Karma works in ways we don't always understand. Gary thought he could silence me, thought he could make me feel small and insignificant. But the truth is, he was the one who had the most to lose. He's facing the consequences of his actions, and that's not just his punishment. It's a message to everyone who thinks they can get away with hate that we will no longer stand by and let it happen. The room erupted in applause. Amara's heart raced. But for the first time, it was a feeling of joy that filled her chest, not anxiety. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found her purpose. The weeks following the speech were filled with media interviews, community outreach programs, and volunteer work. Amara was no longer just a woman living in an apartment complex. She had become a leader in her community, someone who was actively working to make the world a better place. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, and now she was empowering others. She continued working with local organizations that fought for racial justice, using her platform to speak out against systemic inequality. She became an advocate for victims of racial profiling, harassment, and discrimination, speaking at conferences and joining discussions on how to foster true equality in society. But amidst all of the recognition and attention, Amara never lost sight of why she had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about the fame. It wasn't about the interviews or the applause. It was about creating a world where people like her didn't have to fight to be seen, to be heard. It was about changing the future for those who would come after her. One evening, as she was sitting in her living room, Amara received a letter in the mail. It was from the apartment complex management, and for a moment, she felt a twinge of anxiety. What now? But when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. The letter was an official apology from the building's management. They acknowledged the harassment she had faced from Gary, and after a thorough review, they expressed regret that they had not taken more immediate action. The letter stated that they would be implementing new policies to ensure that no tenant would ever have to experience the same kind of discrimination or harassment again. Amara smiled softly to herself, tears welling up in her eyes. This was more than just recognition, it was change, real, tangible change. Gary had been the catalyst, but it was Amara's strength, her refusal to back down, that had created a ripple effect that would continue long after he was gone. A few months later, Amara sat with her parents, visiting them back in Chicago. They had always supported her, even when the world around her told her she didn't belong. As she sat at their kitchen table, she realized just how far she had come. She had proven to herself that she was stronger than the world had ever given her credit for. Her mother looked at her with pride, placing a hand on hers. "Amara, I always knew you would do something great," her mother said softly. "You've always had it in you." Amara smiled, feeling her heart swell. "I didn't know I had it in me either, but I've learned something important. The fight doesn't end with one victory. We keep going. We keep speaking. We keep pushing for a world where everyone is seen and heard." The months following Amara's pivotal speech were nothing short of transformational, not just for her, but for the community at large. As her story continued to resonate with people around the city, her influence began to spread like wildfire. People who had once felt powerless now saw Amara as proof that one voice, one action, could spark a wave of change. The apartment complex was the first place to feel the shift. Gary's departure was followed by a sense of relief, but it wasn't just the end of one man's tyranny, it was the beginning of a broader, deeper change. In the weeks that followed his arrest, the management had implemented new policies aimed at tackling racism and discrimination head-on. Amara had been instrumental in pushing for this, but the community's support was what made it possible. People began to realize the power of speaking out. The complex was no longer a place of tension and fear. Residents who had once been too afraid to confront their own biases were now engaged in open conversations about racism, inequality, and justice. Amara's bravery had given them the courage to face the uncomfortable truths they had been avoiding for years. They had found their voice through her voice. Amara's days were now filled with speaking engagements, community outreach, and working with local organizations that focused on racial justice. She had become an official advocate for the very causes she had once been silent about. Every time she shared her story, she saw the same recognition in the eyes of those who were listening. They had been there too. Her work took her to schools, community centers, and even government meetings where she met with policymakers to discuss the creation of more inclusive systems. She was invited to participate in activist forums and panels, talking about how the legal system could better protect marginalized communities and how individuals could make a difference through small, everyday acts of resistance. But it wasn't just the adults who were listening. Young people were particularly moved by Amara's story. At a high school assembly where Amara spoke about her experience standing up to Gary, she found herself surrounded by teenagers who thanked her for giving them hope. They didn't want to be silent anymore. They wanted to speak out, to challenge the injustices they saw around them. One teenage girl, Jasmine, approached her after the talk, her eyes full of admiration. "Amara, I don't know if I could ever do what you did," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been so scared to speak up in class when I hear racist comments, but hearing you talk today, it made me feel like I can fight back. Thank you." Amara smiled at Jasmine, her heart swelling with pride. "You can fight back, Jasmine. We all can. It starts with one step." But not all of Amara's experiences were met with applause. The backlash she faced was still very much present, though it came in more subtle forms. As she continued to speak out and engage with the public, there were moments when she was dismissed, silenced, or made to feel like her words weren't as valuable as those of people with more experience. But those were the moments that reminded her just how far she had come. She had already conquered the hardest battle. She had stood up to Gary, and nothing could diminish that victory. It wasn't just strangers who stood behind Amara either. Her parents were her steadfast supporters, always there to listen when the weight of it all became too much. Her father, who had worked long hours to provide for his family, had always told her, "You're not just fighting for yourself, Amara. You're fighting for everyone who comes after you." And her mother? She was a pillar of unwavering strength, often reminding Amara that sometimes the path to justice isn't easy, but it's worth walking. In the following months, Amara received a call from the mayor's office. They wanted her to serve on the advisory board for racial equity, a program designed to address discrimination across various sectors in the city. It was an honor, one that seemed impossible only a year ago, but Amara knew it wasn't just about her name being on a list, it was about making real changes. The conversations she was having now were no longer about personal grievances. They were about systemic change, about creating opportunities for future generations, and about dismantling systems of oppression that had been in place for far too long. As she entered her role on the advisory board, Amara worked tirelessly alongside community leaders, educators, and activists to put concrete policies in place that would promote equality and combat racism. It was a long road ahead, but Amara was no longer the person who was afraid to speak up. She had become the person who drove change. At home, Amara's life had settled into a new rhythm. She had grown close to her neighbors, who had rallied around her in the wake of Gary's arrest. Mrs. Keller, who had first approached Amara with flowers, became one of her closest confidants. The two would often sit together in Amara's apartment, sipping tea and discussing everything from politics to how they could further improve the apartment complex. They began to plan community building events, potlucks, and open discussions about how to maintain a culture of inclusion. One evening, as Amara and Mrs. Keller were sitting in the cozy living room, Amara found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The weight of everything she had done felt real now, but it was the people around her that made it all worth it. "Amara, you've changed everything here," Mrs. Keller said, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "When I moved here, it felt like I had to keep my head down, stay out of trouble. But now, I feel like I have a voice. You've inspired us all to speak out, to demand better." Amara smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. "We've all changed, Mrs. Keller. It wasn't just me. It was everyone who was ready for things to be different. We're stronger together." One evening, as Amara stood outside on her balcony, the sun setting over the city, she received another call, this one from Detective Sullivan. "Amara," he said, "I just wanted to let you know that the case against Gary is finally closing. He'll be facing trial soon, and all the evidence you provided will play a key role in the outcome. You did a lot more than just bring him to justice. You've set a precedent." Amara felt a quiet satisfaction. Gary would face the consequences of his actions, but for Amara, this wasn't the end. It was just another step in her journey. In the months that followed, Amara continued to rise as a leader advocating for justice, equality, and change. She had not only exposed Gary's wrongdoing, but had also inspired a community to stand up for what was right. As she reflected on her journey, from a woman who once feared to speak up to someone who had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of those around her, Amara knew that the true legacy of her actions wasn't about the accolades or recognition. It was about the change she had created and the path she had paved for others to follow. Amara stood in the middle of the community center where it all began, the place where she had first spoken out, where her journey to justice had taken root. Now, as she looked around at the faces in the crowd, she saw a different kind of light. It wasn't just admiration, it was hope. The rally for racial justice was taking place in this very room, and Amara had been invited to speak once again. But this time, she wasn't just a speaker, she was a symbol of resilience, of transformation. She had been through so much, from the quiet pain of enduring Gary's harassment to the overwhelming power of standing up and exposing his dark secrets. But as she looked out at the crowd, Amara realized that she had come full circle. She was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows, but the one who had taken control, who had challenged the system and won. It had been months since Gary's arrest. The legal proceedings had concluded, and he had faced the consequences of his actions. His trial had been a public spectacle, but for Amara, it was the final chapter in a story she had never asked to be a part of. She had exposed his crimes, and now he would serve his time. But even more significant than his punishment had been the change that had rippled through the community. The apartment complex was no longer the same. The policies on discrimination had been overhauled, and the management was now working closely with residents to ensure that the environment was inclusive and fair. The people had risen. Neighbors who had once felt powerless to challenge the status quo were now speaking out, demanding better treatment for everyone. Amara had become a voice for those who felt voiceless, and through her, they had found strength. But tonight, as she prepared to speak at the rally, Amara felt something deeper, something more personal. Her journey wasn't just about Gary. It had never been just about him. It was about her own awakening, about realizing the strength she had inside herself and the power she could wield when she chose to stand up. The room fell silent as Amara took her place at the podium, the weight of the crowd's attention settling around her. She could feel the warmth of their energy, the hope in the air, and the quiet anticipation. It wasn't just her story anymore. It had become their story, too. The story of people coming together, refusing to accept the status quo, and standing united for justice. Amara cleared her throat, taking a deep breath. She had delivered speeches before, but this one felt different. It was as if the world was listening, and in a way, it was, as she began to speak, her voice resonated with a quiet strength that wasn't there when she first arrived in this city. "We all have our battles, don't we?" she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Some of us fight in silence. Some of us are too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the consequences. I used to be like that. I used to think that if I stayed quiet, things would just go away. But I've learned that silence only perpetuates the very things we want change. We can't stay silent anymore." She paused, glancing out at the crowd, their eyes locked on her, listening intently. Gary's arrest wasn't just the end of one man's reign of terror. It was the beginning of something much bigger. It was a wake-up call, not just for me, but for all of us. We don't have to accept hate. We don't have to stand by while others suffer. We have the power to stand up, to make noise, and to change the world around us. A wave of emotion washed over her as she continued. And this journey isn't over. This is just one chapter in a much larger story. The fight for racial justice, for equality, for respect, it doesn't end when the headlines fade. It's a fight we have to keep having every single day. We have to keep challenging the systems that hurt us, and we have to do it together. Amara's voice cracked slightly, but she didn't falter. "I never thought I would be standing here today. I never thought I would be the one speaking out, let alone leading a movement. But what I've learned is that we all have a voice, and when we use it together, we create something unstoppable." The crowd erupted into applause, but Amara didn't pause. She didn't let the applause overwhelm her, because she knew it wasn't about her. It was about the people in the room, the community that had risen with her. This is our moment. We can't let it slip away. We have to keep fighting for what's right, not just for us, but for the generations that will come after us. We are the change we've been waiting for. The room roared in approval, and Amara's heart swelled with pride. The realization hit her like a wave. Her actions had sparked something monumental. She had started something far bigger than herself. And in doing so, she had empowered others to rise up and create their own change. After the rally, Amara walked through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling at familiar faces. It was amazing how many people had come together, strangers, neighbors, activists, united by the belief that they could make a difference. She saw Jasmine again, the teenage girl who had approached her after the first talk, now standing confidently among her peers. "Thank you, Amara," Jasmine said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've inspired me to be braver, to speak up for others." Amara smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "You've got this, Jasmine. You're the future." Later that evening, Amara sat in her apartment, reflecting on the day's events. The city stretched out before her, the lights twinkling in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. It wasn't because everything was perfect. It wasn't. There was still so much work to be done. But she had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had not only changed her life, but had sparked a movement that would continue long after she was gone. Amara looked at the photos of her family on the shelf. Her parents had always believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. She had done it for them, for her community, for everyone who had ever been silenced. But now, she was doing it for herself. As she leaned back in her chair, Amara closed her eyes and smiled. She had created a legacy, one of strength, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her journey wasn't just about her victories. It was about the change she had ignited. The world had responded. And now, it was her turn to rest, knowing that the path she had paved would be followed by others for years to come.